Welcome to Game Theorem, where we have serious discussions about absurd entertainment. So Kyle, in our introduction episode, you said you hated fantasy.
I did.
I was just wondering, why is that? And would you like to have an actual discussion about your reasons?
Oh, I would actually. Thanks for asking, Kira. See, when I grew up, never grew up playing those particular games. I played many types of games, but never the stereotypical fantasy genre. And therefore, when I look back on the games, I don't have this, rose-colored glasses nostalgia for them. And I see them for what they really are, which at best is unimaginative and at worst is toxic and prejudicial.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective on it.
Well, I'm Kyle.
I'm Kira.
And this is what we're going to be talking about today.
Yep.
So, where should we start?
Well, I can say, like you said, you hadn't grown up playing those games. I haven't exactly grown up playing them, but they were definitely a part of my teenage years.
So you just got hooked a little bit later than most?
Yes.
Okay. Because, I know most people, at least, growing up in the 90s, they were hooked on Legend of Zelda particularly.
Oh, I honestly can say that I did not get into Legend of Zelda until much later on.
I guess I'll have to start by really pitching my case, and you just interrupt me if you want to try to point out holes in my case.
All
Kira.
right.
All right. I know this might come across as a bit like blasphemy to a lot of people out there because, the whole fantasy trope is, people associate it with video games. Which, that's okay. I understand that because it's so pervasive there. But it is pervasive across all types of media. Movies, games, board games, books, all of it.
Actually started with books, I believe.
Well, truthfully, I'm going to make my case by going from a historical perspective. It started with real-world mythology.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I see. Okay.
So it has Germanic roots, specifically. All across Europe, but a lot of it are from the Germanic tribes. Some of these end up becoming, the Celtic peoples before they were conquered by the Romans and became the English. But, there's different versions of it depending on which place in Europe they're from.
All right, I didn't know that.
And a lot of what we consider stereotypical fantasy archetypes and creatures originate from these, mythological and somewhat historical roots.
Yeah, I definitely see that those would be the roots of modern fantasy.
Okay, if I ask you, I think I've already answered this for you off mic, but pretend I hadn't done that. And if I asked you, what were mythical elves like? What would your answer be?
Mythological?
Mythological elves. What were they like?
I would...
Not Christmas elves.
I would probably say more like, mischievous types, maybe something sort of like a pixie or something like that. Or honestly, what comes to mind is like Legolas and that kind of thing, like nimble archers.
All right. Were they medium height, tall, or short?
I guess taller, right. I would say.
Right. But you now know this is incorrect, right?
Yes, I do.
Mm-hmm. And I don't mean to single you out, Kira. I'm just trying to use your perspective as a lover of fantasy here, since you're the only one we've got right now.
Yeah.
But some people might think, they might see the fantasy elf and think that's in some way relevant to actual Germanic mythology or European mythology, and it is not whatsoever. In fact, mythological elves were typically shorter. Now, some people might get that. Christmas elves are short, and I'm sure there's plenty of other elves you can find that are short.
Yes.
So some people might not have known that. But there was really nothing that special about them. They were mischievous, like you were saying. And, they were kind of magical in quality. But every story really just kind of has a different tale about them. They often really didn't meddle with anything. In fact, most depictions I could find of these elves literally just wore like rags and garments. Huh. They didn't have like their own civilization or anything.
I see.
So this is very different than what you'll see today.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay, and then, so what else we got? Goblins. There were some tales of goblins. And dwarves. I don't remember seeing anything about dwarves.
What about orcs? Are they like literally just a modern invention?
They are mentioned like literally less than a handful of times throughout mythology. From the research I did, I could find so little evidence of them. Almost everything came up with modern day stuff, because really it's just like the elf, but worse, that the modern day orc is a made up thing. Whereas what you might consider the mythological orc was really just synonymous with brute.
Yeah, I can understand that.
Right. And I mean, night elves literally were not even a thing.
Oh yeah.
So yeah. Oh, I mean, the dragons are cool, I guess.
Yeah, dragons are cool.
They're just basically like, what if there were lizards and snakes and bats and they were all together and big?
Dragons are awesome, though.
Well, not just those animals, but basically just a whole bunch of creatures. They were essentially like one of the earliest monster chimeras. I mean, dragons appear more lizard-like today, but they didn't always. Dragons used to have fur.
Oh, really?
European dragons, anyway.
Ah, I see.
Very different from the Eastern dragons. Anyway, so yeah, those are the mythological roots behind all of it. But suffice it to say, none of that matters. None of it.
Yeah.
Because while that may have inspired people, it only matters in as much as those tales inspired one particular man. And that is J.R.R. Tolkien. You might know him as the guy that wrote Lord of the Rings.
Now, do you have any idea when Lord of the Rings came out?
It was sometime between World War I and World War II.
What about the original, like, Dungeons and Dragons, like, tabletop kind of thing?
I was going to get to that later.
Okay, I was just wondering which came first,
Lord of the Rings.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
Lord of the Rings is one of those things that just keeps getting remade and or expanded upon.
Okay.
So, yeah, he wrote Lord of the Rings, and he was very meticulous to making the world. He based a lot of his research off of mythological stuff, but, he was an author. He was a writer. He wrote his own stuff. He made orcs as we know them. He changed elves to be like a noble people.
Actually, did you know that in that series, orcs are literally meant to be a cursed peoples and a cursed version of elves? Like, their tongue is literally supposed to be a very bastardized version of Elvish tongue. Their language. Yes.
Okay. Do you know if that was the case from the very start of the series incarnation, or that's just a current thing?
I think it has something to do with the lore of Lord of the Rings.
Right.
And honestly, that is seen in future fantasy where, like, orcs are supposed to have been a cursed or severed peoples from original elven people.
Right. Okay.
That is in the lore of other fantasy.
Well, see, the thing is, The Lord of the Rings was so successful that it ended up being the template for which we get the entire stereotypical genre of fantasy.
Wow.
It wasn't, people don't source from the actual European mythology in as much as they really just source from Tolkien.
Yeah, I can definitely see that.
Like, for example, Tolkien grew up at a time where eugenics was big.
Oh,
now,
really?
he was not himself a eugenicist. In fact, when World War II later came around and we had Nazis, he condemned them. Rightfully so. But I feel like a lot of his work, you could argue, is a product of its time.
Oh, yeah.
You can make the argument that, like you might look at Washington American history and be like, oh, Washington's a great guy, but he had slaves, and that's bad, so we should hate Washington, right? But then you could excuse, well, it was a product of his time. He didn't like having slaves. He let them all go. You can make conciliations like that. I'm not going to take a side on that. So I'm just offering that as a plausible defense. So
yeah,
there, you already got one, Kira.
Well, honestly, what I was gonna actually, I think you're gonna bring this up about the elves and the orcs.
I already brought them up.
Well, yeah, but like what they were based on. It
just say what you're gonna say.
Well.
Okay. I know what you're saying. Okay. Colonialism.
Yes.
We kind of skipped that, but that's because it's not really. I guess I'm saying we don't really have a lot of evidence for this, but when you think about it, it really is based on colonialism because it's all about European mythology, right? Why European? This was written. Tolkien was American, right?
I
don't remember, but
I don't know.
There have been a lot of times where, like, the elves, they're, like, always Caucasian, are they not?
Yes.
And you might think, oh, it's European and whatnot. But then you have other races, like the Orcs, which bear more resemblance to, like Northern African tribes.
Yeah, actually, that's why I mentioned the thing about the Orcs being in the lore being a bastardized race of elves. Like they split off from them, because I feel like that sort of plays into the whole argument of colonization, because, you know, all people are technically descended from common ancestors, but they turn out differently.
Even though in reality, we all descend from Africa. Mm-hmm. But I'm not going to go on too much about the colonialism thing, because there's not really hard evidence there.
Yeah, I understand.
But
that.
I definitely think you could make the argument that there's tones.
Mm-hmm.
But what I do know is that with Lord of the Rings, Tolkien differentiated every type of person by their race. The word race is used all the time.
Yeah.
Not species. He didn't consider that they were species, but that they were races.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's not even like they're subspecies in that, oh, well, they're basically different species, but they can interbreed. But they call them races. And this has some problematic connotations.
Oh, yeah.
And you might think it doesn't matter, but when you start having like elves versus orcs, like you have a race of people that are considered to be noble and righteous and Caucasian, despite the fact that real elves were not considered any of those things. And then you have the opposite of that, orcs, where you have an entire race of people which are said to be, you know, monstrous, devilish, evil.
And they're always really dark-skinned or differently colored.
Yeah, like they're either green or, you know, probably have some blacks in there or purple. Mm-hmm. I think the most common one is green. Mm-hmm. Maybe some grayish or reddish stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, they're always just weird, you know, either colorful or dark colors.
Yeah.
And, you know, they're always the other. And it's very problematic, I think, anytime you have like an entire race of people that are bad. I feel like you could have a story where you have species, you got this species, this species, this species. It's kind of like kingdoms or countries, but instead of different peoples, they're species. I feel like that could be an interesting story, but even when doing so, you have to keep in mind with countries, you don't have a country full of bad people, and you don't have a country full of good people, you know?
Yeah.
I'm just saying, from the very beginning, the word race instead of species was used, and this is going to affect the fantasy genre from its very beginning.
Oh, yeah. Although I really feel like Lord of the Rings, or at least The Hobbit, more for me personally, had just such a great story to it. And I didn't get into any of the minutia. Honestly, I could probably say that I never really got or finished the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. But, like, for example, The Hobbit, the adventure was just really resonated with me. And the fact that the main character was this normal guy who just decided to go on an adventure anyway, and who ends up being courageous and saving his friends and ends up being like really close to these dwarves and such. It's just, I feel like it was a really good story personally.
Awesome. Let me ruin it for you.
Great. I don't know that much of the backstory for Lord of the Rings. I have not read any of those like giant, horrible, like books that are just literally filled with backstory.
I mean, Tolkien didn't just make race, though. He made a hierarchy of races.
Really?
Yes, there are races that are better than others.
How do you determine that?
Like Hobbit is at the bottom of the hierarchy.
Really?
Yes.
I did not realize that.
Or at least I don't know if it's the very bottom. I don't know the entire hierarchy, but it's really low on there.
Oh, you know what? Does that play into what races get how many rings?
I'm not aware.
Okay, so in The Legend of Lord of the Rings, each race gets a different number of rings. The hobbits don't get any.
Well, maybe that's a signifier of it, if nothing else.
Man, I believe, gets 9 rings. Dwarves get 4. Elves get 2. And I believe one race gets like 7. But yeah, like there's different amounts of rings that go to each race.
Okay. Well, the thing about The Hobbit is, in the actual story of The Hobbit, one thing it tells you very early on are what hobbits are. Mm-hmm. It says that hobbits are a race that has never studied magic.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. Now, the main character is supposed to be an exception to this. Mm-hmm. The whole story is about, it's kind of like an underdog thing where, like, oh, I may be from the lowest ranked people, the lowest ranked race, but I can prove that I'm actually one of the good ones or something like that. Like I can be really strong and powerful despite my genetic drawbacks.
You know what's interesting about that?
What?
In the online game, Lord of the Rings Online, hobbits are actually the more like rogues. Which, if you remember, that is the whole reason they went to Bilbo in the first place, is because apparently hobbits make good thieves.
Okay, so that's saying that you have an entire people that are not trustworthy.
I guess,
Is that not racist?
Fair enough.
We could say it's specious, but no, they're not species, they're races.
Yeah.
So the problem I have, even if you're going to be like, okay, yeah, sure, there's an exception, you're still saying that like this entire race of people, aside from that one, has never learned magic. Never. Like, seriously, you're saying that's like this race has never learned. I mean, you could tell me like, oh, the people of this kingdom don't value magic. It's not part of their culture, so most of them will never read it. I could understand that. That actually is a fair claim that you could make in your mythological world, your fictional world. But you say like, oh, this race never reads magic. I'm like, who are you to say that?
Actually, Bilbo's past family line, some people in his past family line were more adventurous hobbits. And they talk about like, actually in his family line, there is literally the tallest hobbit ever. But yeah, he actually has a family line of people in his past ancestors that have been exceptions to that rule.
Anyway, we might bring it up again, but this is the basis of the fantasy mythos. Mm-hmm. After it was so successful, a lot of other companies tried to copy what they did, or they built off of it, so to speak. I'm surprised. If copyright law was like it is now, they would have gotten totally sued.
Yeah.
Because one of the big other ones that came out was Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a sort of board game, but different than what you would consider a normal board game because of the way they have the game master. There's like infinite permutations of the way this game can play out.
Mm-hmm. It's the basic tabletop game.
And I have never personally played Dungeons and Dragons.
I haven't either, but I have read some of the books.
It's mostly just because I've never had a group of friends that would want to play with me.
Yeah, me neither.
I don't know. Maybe we could talk about this someday, about this thing that seemed to be big in the 90s, and not as big today, where there's just such a stigma against exceptionally nerdy things like Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
So much so that pretty much the way to define a nerdy character is to say they play Dungeons and Dragons at some points.
Yeah, in the past.
Yeah.
I feel like it's more accepted and more like in our culture these days, but it definitely was a stigma.
I mean, even as a nerd growing up, you could be ostracized for playing Dungeons and Dragons just because that was too nerdy.
Fair enough.
I would have still liked to try. I just never got the chance.
Yeah.
Anyway, Dungeons and Dragons, they kind of solidified a lot of the tropes that were found in the fantasy genre. Mm-hmm. In fact, when you pick a character or a class in Dungeons and Dragons, it translates literally to stats changes.
Yes, depending on which one you pick.
Yes, which can be kind of bad. I mean, because, races shouldn't have physical attributes. Species, sure. But again, you got the terminology confusion between those two words.
Yeah. Although, actually, I don't think Dungeons and Dragons uses race as much.
You mean the word?
Yeah.
No, I know they do.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I did some research and I found plenty of mention of races by them. To make matters even worse, Dungeons and Dragons, they're the ones that ended up introducing the Night Elf.
Okay, so I wanted to tell you something about this, actually.
Okay.
So the book series, the most famous book series in the Dungeons and Dragons lore, is about is specifically about a night elf called Drizzt Do'Urden.
Oh yeah, I know him. I learned about him in my research for this.
Yes. So in the book series, his race is considered more cunning and like ambitious and sort of they're basically like the Slytherins of the Dungeons and Dragons world.
If the Slytherins were all dark-skinned.
Yes. They live underground and they have this specific society with like rankings and stuff. And Drizzt kind of grows up a bit higher ranking than most of those elves, but basically nobody trusts dark elves. Nobody in that world does. So when he is one of the very few who actually ends up leaving the underground and interacting with the outside world, no one trusts him, and he often actually sometimes gets blamed for crimes that he didn't commit when he first comes out of the underground.
All right, but do you have a point that you're leading to?
My point was that there were others like Drizzt Do'Urden, I believe, in the lore of elves that weren't typical to their race. Like, he was an exception to the rule, and I believe that there are others, but he was the main one where he actually very much valued other people's lives and really wasn't cool with Dark Elf society, which is the reason why he left in the first place. So, yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to take a deep breath for this one. Mm-hmm. Okay. I got a lot to say about that. First of all, night elves are racist. They're terrible ideas. Like, whoever came up with that should be fired, except they're probably dead by now.
Okay.
The entire idea of other mythological creatures in the fantasy genre were already racially problematic, about how all elves were supposed to be Caucasian, and how, like, the problematic connotations of orcs. I mean, it's hard to find, any non-Caucasian characters within any of the mythological creatures. And you might be like, well, it's Europe, but that's not like other people from other countries never went to Europe. Mm-hmm. I mean, look at all the wars between Europe and the Muslim world, or even all the trade between Mediterranean and Northern Africa,
Yeah.
So I find that hard to believe. But then you come out with night elves, and you're like, oh, those good Caucasian elves we have, right? How about some evil elves that have darker skin? It was such a bad idea. You have an entire race that is considered, like you were saying, evil and backstabby and not trustworthy. But not to mention that, like, the elves had a very ordered government to them. And they had a society and organization, right? Mm-hmm. They had, like, elders, right?
Yes.
Do you know how the night elves structure?
Yeah, how?
They have a much looser structure to them because they're so backstabby. But they're a matriarchy.
Oh, I remember that.
Because matriarchies are bad.
Wow.
Okay, I mean, they didn't say that, but when you give, like, when you make, like, oh, we got an elf race, which is good, and then we got the anti-elves, the evil elves, and by the way, they're led by a woman.
You know what? Actually, I think in the Dungeons and Dragons series, elves are supposed to be arrogant, like regular elves are seen as pretty arrogant and haughty by the other races.
Okay, that would make sense. I feel like that's a more apt take on it. Mm-hmm. Because then you're basically saying, like, oh, elves are they're all high and mighty and everything, but you're taking it like you're not agreeing with them. Mm-hmm. So if you agree with them, you're like, oh yeah, elves are awesome. And if you don't agree with them, you're like, well, they think they're awesome. I feel like that's at least a step removed from it. So yeah, the night elves, I forget what they're called, like the drow or something.
Drow. Yes, okay. DROW.
But night elf is the generic term because because this is just a implication for fantasy across the board. Yeah, in
Elder Scrolls, they're called dark elves, and yeah.
In fact, this is so problematic, and so many people got upset about it that today, most of the time, when you see a night elf, it's going to have purplish skin.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Not all the time. Actually, I don't even know what Lord of the Rings, how they do it nowadays.
I don't know. I know Dungeons and Dragons, they actually had really dark skin because they had the character had white hair.
Oh no, I know Dungeons and Dragons, they did dark skin, like non-Caucasian skin, but
It's
I don't
like
know.
bluish purple.
Not always. No, originally it was just like, dark brown.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I didn't realize that actually because every depiction of Driz I've seen has like bluish purplish skin.
Well, that's not how it originally was.
Yeah.
But Dungeons and Dragons is something that's been evolving. It keeps going, right?
Yeah.
And there was one particular author. He was the one who wrote the book you're talking about.
R.L. Salvatore?
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yeah.
He's the one who wrote that book. And he wrote a lot of other stuff as well.
Honestly, I really want to finish that book series because I read the first couple books and I really enjoyed the story.
Right. Well, he basically tried to humanize one of the characters. He basically took her. Well, it was kind of like The Hobbit we talked about. It's like, oh, you got a race of backstabbing evil people that are led by a woman, right? Mm-hmm. Let's talk about one of them and how he's like, no, I'm going to reject my kind. I'm going to be good. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about racism, about why does everyone think I'm bad? Well, maybe because your entire race is evil, apparently.
Well, I believe he has some people who help him through his life and some friends he had, but he has to leave all that behind when he leaves.
No, but like every person he meets when he's traveling in the world is like racist to him. Not everyone, but most of them are racist towards him.
Yeah.
But I feel like that kind of falls flat on its face. Because in the real world, when you're racist, it's like, why are you treating me bad just because of like some superficial thing, right? Mm-hmm. But in the story, it's like, no, you're right to fear the night elves or whatever because they're so evil and they do terrible things to you. And
well, also it's partly because of isolationism. Hardly anybody has ever actually even seen a night elf because they all live underground and they are very isolationist.
Okay, well, it's not like the portrayal of them as evil is incorrect within the lore. Basically the lore is no, they really are evil.
Yeah.
It feels like why are you going to judge me based on my race? It's not fair that you're judging me based on my race. You're racist. And then the person being accused as being racist replies, but all your people eat people.
Well, they don't.
Well, it's just an example. No, we have factual evidence that our racist points are correct.
Yeah.
So that's what I find very problematic.
Yeah, I can understand that, definitely.
So, but at the same time, though, despite this, I feel like the author was trying to make the world a better place, make it less racist by having that story. Because basically at the end of the day, you do get a good character that's very strong and whatnot, right?
Yeah.
And it's a very powerful representation of a minority character.
Yeah, actually, in the beginning, he has to work really hard to hide his appearance whenever he tries to interact with people.
So I'm just saying, it would be very fair to condemn that story for a racist depiction of a whole group of people, while at the same time having a proactive representation of a dark-skinned lead character.
Yeah. Driz is honestly so awesome. I've got to finish reading it.
There's actually this trope. It comes along with the line of, you are a testament to your race. Mm-hmm. And it's the idea that you do something heroic or brave or courageous, and another character is like, oh, you are a testament to your race. It comes across kind of like, I normally would be racist towards you, but you're a good one.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Actually, that happens to...
That is Driz's entire story.
Yes.
That is how basically everyone treats him.
Well, after he gets more well-known.
Well, yeah. Once he gets past the whole racist part,
yeah.
Even then it's like, oh, well, you're an exception. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like we could trample all over Native America, but parade Pocahontas around in England.
Yeah, that
kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Because she's a princess. That was 12. Anyway, so this is some of the problems that I have with fantasy. There's many other derivative works after this, and that Salvatore, or whoever it was that wrote that story, did leave the place a less directly racist place. He kind of muddied the waters a bit because he tried to undo some of that racism. But the thing is, a lot of fantasy games or stories that talk about fantasy, they fall into the same tropes, and I find it so problematic. I feel if you want to do fantasy right, take your own spin on it. You can either build off existing fantasy and fix the problems, or you can just make your own fantasy. I mean, fantasy is so diverse. Why does everything have to be European medieval? I saw this article where someone was talking about their fantasy book they were making, and it was a fantasy story set in Egypt. And they were literally told by their publisher that if your fantasy story does not take place in medieval Europe, it is less likely to sell.
Wow.
And that they were less likely as a publisher to take on such a book.
Wow.
Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, yeah, I can see the frustration, and I do agree that fantasy can be problematic. However, I do believe that there is still some really good stories to tell and some good things to come out of the genre.
But I feel whenever they try to do that, you're starting at a disadvantage. It's like trying to tell a story and be progressive, but you take a very non-progressive topic. I mean, it's like trying to talk about the, like rebels under an oppressive regime or something. You have to first talk. You have to try to justify why you're talking about the story. That, oh no, these guys are different. So if you're picking a fantasy setting, I am personally not going to be interested unless you sell me on how you're going to be different. And the fact that most of them don't even try to do that. They try to sell towards like, oh no, we are fantasy. Don't you like fantasy? Everyone likes fantasy. I just turn away and go, nope.
I do like fantasy though. Like I said, I feel like you're missing out on some great stories by...
But I feel like I'm missing out on so many that are not. I'm dodging a pile of needles, and you're just telling me that, well, there might be a couple hay in there. Sorry, that's a weird analogy, I know.
It's supposed to be the opposite way.
No, not in my case. No, because I feel like by doing that, I only have a limited amount of time on this earth. I only have a limited amount of media I can consume. And if I choose things other than fantasy, I have a higher success rate at getting an actual interesting story and not something of recycled old tropes.
Okay, I believe that is a fair assessment, but I still honestly have personally been touched and been like really emotionally moved by stories that were set in fantasy and also had such a great time. And so I feel like maybe even though generally you should maybe avoid fantasy, I feel like you should maybe take a second look at things that are supposed to do it differently or people say is just really good even despite that. I
mean, I feel like in our world full of advertising, that effort should not be on my part.
Well, then just let me do it because I often can sift through fantasy.
You can do that, but that series will be at nothing but a disadvantage. If they don't market how different they are, if that's not something that's like a defining feature of that fantasy game, then it's just going to go unnoticed. And maybe you're right. Maybe it should be noticed. It's a really good game, and I'll just never be aware of it. But that can go for anything. You make a game called Beach Balls Infinite, and it actually has a really in-depth story between these two beach balls. I might have missed that just because I don't care about beach balls.
Okay.
But, I mean, you can bring up a fair point of comparing fantasy to something like science fiction.
What do you mean?
Because, I mean, I expected you to bring up this as a counterpoint, but you could argue that maybe some of the things I said for fantasy apply to science fiction.
Oh, yes, definitely, because, like, science fiction has tropes as well that it often follows, like, typical time travel or even just normal science stuff that they talk about, or, like they have a generic story about someone being caught out in space, or like generic aliens or, stuff like that.
But I would argue that both in originality and in progressivism, science fiction will always win out on fantasy.
I feel like you might have a point just because science fiction tends to be more innovative because it is specifically focused on future or more scientifically based things.
Right. So, okay, let's first talk about originality, right? Mm-hmm. Fantasy, they always have their set tropes. There's a template for fantasy, right? And as you deviate from that, you become less of what the template is. So you're actually encouraged to stick to that template, because if you don't, then you have something that's different, a different kind of fantasy. And some people might not be into that, as I previously illustrated. But with science fiction, there isn't so much of a template. Science fiction is really all just kind of what if. There's technology, and there are many recurring tropes with science fiction. But I feel like there's so much room for possibility, because straying from any supposed kind of template is actually encouraged, because people will buy science fiction, no matter what the medium is, just because oh, well, what if this? I never thought of that before. I want to see how that turns out.
I guess that's a fair argument. I still enjoy fantasy on its own merits.
I feel that there is stereotypical fantasy, and I do not like it. But there is stereotypical science fiction that I don't like either. Sometimes I'll try science fiction and I come out bad. I a bad roll of the dice. But there is also very much good science fiction. And there is good fantasy. There are fantasies I have enjoyed before. I just feel that because people try to stick to the template in fantasy of what the fantasy genre is supposed to be, whereas I feel the science fiction genre inherently encourages innovation and new ideas, that science fiction always has a greater chance of originality than fantasy does.
I can understand that, but I still enjoy my own fantasies.
I mean, really, I don't think it should be that way. I mean, when you get down to it...
I understand that, because...
Sorry.
I just really enjoy the template of fantasy. Sometimes I enjoy magic and,
but it's
grabbing
magic.
A sword.
It's magic. The possibilities should literally be infinite. If science fiction is just like a what if based on all human knowledge and what might be possible in the future, fantasy should not care about any of that. They should just be like, what if, period. Forget about what we know. Forget about what we don't know. I'm going to put a dragon in here. There's going to be a wizard. There's going to be an octopus with wings, and it's going to go underground, and it can turn everyone into porcupines. Fantasy should be unlimited. Why do we have to stick to these tropes? Why elves? Why orcs? Because it was popular in another series 100 years ago, and we have to keep that tradition going to get people to buy our product? I mean, yes, that's the answer. But I don't like it. I don't think that's a good answer.
It works on me.
I feel like inevitably there's going to be a time where we have the next Lord of the Rings, the next big fantasy, and then everyone's going to base it on that one.
I think that's definitely a possibility.
We just haven't reached that point yet, and I don't know when we ever will.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Because some of the best fantasies that I've liked the most are the ones that stray from the template. Do I have anything more to say on science fiction? Do you have anything?
Not really. I just feel like
we talked about the originality, but we didn't talk about the progressiveness of it.
Oh yeah, because I understand that, because science fiction tends to be set in the future. So a lot of times people are just like, oh, we don't care about this because it's the freaking future.
Yeah, it's actually it's a very simple proposition. Mankind, humanity, should is always getting more and more progressive. Many countries, or at least ours, are legalizing gay marriage. Slavery is officially outlawed in basically every country, even if it's still practiced underground. And in our country and many other first world countries, it's literally illegal to be discriminatory.
Yeah.
So while we still have a whole bunch of things that aren't on the books that we still have to address, we are at a better place than we ever have been.
Yeah, and that's always true.
Yes. And I mean, that's great. That should be celebrated, but don't sit down. There's work to be done.
Yeah.
So that's great. But every time you look in the past, the further back you go, the more oppressive it is.
Yeah.
You don't have freedom of orientation, of religion, of race, you know? Mm-hmm. Like you don't have freedom of ideas. And sometimes, I mean, look at the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah.
So
nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody. And I just feel like if you're ever going to have a story in the past, you're more likely to run into those ideas. And if you unabashedly try to represent the past, like many people think fantasy represents the medieval era, I feel you're not going to have as many progressive opportunities. You can. Now, don't get me wrong. You can do it. But it's not part of the template. The template there's nowhere on the template that talks about progressivism or anything. In fact, most of the things on the template, the different races like elves and night elves and orcs are very not progressive, at least at the way that they're usually presented in media.
Mm-hmm. But what do you think about stories and fantasy using those ideas of, this is in the past, so there's racism and slavery and stuff, to tell a story about it, or to, have you interact with those concepts?
Well, I mean, I definitely think that's good, or it has the potential to be good. Mm-hmm. But I think with fantasy though, you're manufacturing a past, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like, oh, let's talk about World War II and the suffering people went through that. You're talking about like, okay, what if there was a past? By the very nature of it being a past, like an alternate version of past, it's inherently not progressive because you're taking place in an alternate world at a time where we were more prejudicial. Mm-hmm. You could use that as a starting point to talk about something else, but most often never do any people do. They just stop right there.
Yeah, I understand that. But actually, I want to talk about an example that does talk about those things.
Well, can we get to that later when we talk about good examples?
Okay.
Because I just want to talk about science fiction first, on the other hand of things.
All right.
Because the reason I think science fiction does better is because, like you were saying, it's always in the future. Well, not always, but it tends to be in the future. Mm-hmm. Because that's what science fiction, like the definition of science fiction is like extrapolating based on what we know and trying to make a plausible fantasy. That's why there's an overlap. There's, science fantasy. Mm-hmm. Science fiction tries to stick more to realism, or to plausible realism at the very least.
Yes.
So when you're in the future, you don't have to worry about stuff. Like a lot of people feel, we're getting more and more progressive, that in the future, they'll just, continue that trend forward and see how progressive we are by that point.
Yeah.
That doesn't always happen. There's many stories where it's regressive, but I feel that if there was a template for science fiction, the idea that, now but better, or now but further along, since we have a trend of getting more progressive and being, at the very least, a lot of the time in the future, if you just take the status quo, we're going to be as we are now, but later. Mm-hmm. And then you have anywhere you can go from that. Some people might go down. They might make it more regressive. They might make it more prejudicial and racist. But a lot of people go the other direction. Star Trek is a big example of that. Star Trek was literally the first time we had an African-American woman on the television.
Oh, yeah.
Because
well, not the first time. It was one of the very first roles not to be like a maid or background character.
Oh,
yeah.
It just feels like it was the first time ever. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand that. And it was like the first time it was actually a prominent speaking, like an actual character.
And that's not to say Star Trek was perfect, but she was the second command on the ship, right?
I don't remember.
But even then, everyone on the ship was somewhat diverse. Mm-hmm. You had, what was Scotty? Irish?
I don't know.
And then you had alien representation, and like I said, on Star Trek wasn't the best. We still had those racial overtones like we do with all of our media. We come from the society. It was the '60s, but I feel like it was a step in the right direction. Yeah. And that's something that science fiction is more likely to take, whereas fantasy is more willing to take the step in the wrong direction. And this is something I felt for a long time.
Okay, so the Elder Scrolls series.
Unfortunately.
Well, in one of the earlier games that came out, I believe, in 2001, called Morrowind, the whole concept is that you are an outsider, an outlander who has come to this country, thrown into this province, and told to, just do this job. And you will very much feel like an outsider. People will literally constantly call you outlander and stuff like that. And certain races will actually be more upset with you depending on what race you are.
Okay.
Like, it affects their disposition towards you. And in that game, they actually tackle the concepts of slavery and racism, in that there are certain races that are slaves.
Do they call them races or species?
Ooh, actually, I think they do call them race.
Okay, that's bad.
But there's these cat people.
Are they human? Okay, no, they're cat people. Okay.
They're cat people and lizard people who are most of the slaves are these kinds of people. And you can interact with this in that you can free the slaves, you can do quests to capture slaves or take them to certain places and do whatever the master wants you to do with them. Like, you have a choice in how you interact with this slavery that exists. And it's a really interesting story in that there are some quests where you can literally, take this slave to where the master wants you to go. They're basically just transport for drugs. And you can either do as they ask, or you have choices, like you can set them free, and eventually you can even join an abolitionist group if you want to. And that is how this whole game interacts with the concept of slavery, because the game takes place in a province where, in the last province that actually allows slavery, because it was their culture. And so to get them to join the empire, they allowed them this concession.
I have to ask you a question, though.
Yeah?
Does it do the same thing that Dungeons & Dragons did, where even if they are enslaving these people, is there a factual basis for their discrimination?
Actually, no, there's not. There's a stigma against these people, but the stigma definitely is proven not to be true often. And you definitely are sympathetic to these slaves.
I mean, if that's the case, then it's definitely a step in the right direction.
Yes, especially in later games when you learn more about these races and interact with more people from these races, you get to see more of them and get to see how they're discriminated against. Actually, in Skyrim, Khajiit, the cat people, aren't allowed in the cities. They are not allowed in the cities because the Nords are racist.
Again, though, I have to ask, does the game also justify this prejudice as if it was a fact? Like do the cat people poop a lot in the city? I don't know.
No. They have a stigma of being thieves.
Are they thieves?
Some of them, but you can talk to these, and most of them are just honest merchants. Okay. And they will literally complain about not being let into the city.
I feel that the fantasy genre has a ton of baggage, and we are in a more progressive time. I guess we're in a more progressive century, and sorry, sometimes it just feels weird to say that, considering everything that's going on these days. Mm-hmm. But how about this? Let me rephrase this from somewhere I heard online once. We're not moving past discrimination in our world, but we're moving through it. Mm-hmm. I feel like that's a more apt way of saying where we are in society. Mm-hmm. So I feel like when you're going to use fantasy genre with its baggage, you're going to get stories like that. You're going to get attempts to address this and not turn a blind eye to the racism that's within your established stories. And I think that ultimately makes it more believable and realistic because of how pervasive these concepts are in our real world. Mm-hmm. So like I said, I definitely think it's a step in the right direction. But that's not enough for me to justify Skyrim existing.
Okay. Fair enough. I do admit that Skyrim doesn't tell as good stories as the earlier games.
Oh, because aren't you like some mythical warrior or something?
Yes, you are the chosen one in Skyrim, whereas in Oblivion, you're technically the chosen one, but you're only chosen to help the actual person who's supposed to be saving the world. Like, you just help them. And in Morrowind, you are just some prisoner who gets let out on this island. And it's actually very debatable whether you like, are the person that they think you are, or whether you just become that person. Or
like most RPGs, you're a nobody, but you get to make what you are of yourself. Whereas in Skyrim, you're the chosen one.
Yes.
Okay.
Which is why I enjoy the earlier games much more than Skyrim.
Probably better storytelling. But, okay, but I want to talk about some things, and we don't have much time left. So Kira, could you quickly go over the list of fantasy games that you have composed? Because I do not have a very big history with fantasy because I avoid the games.
Okay.
So I'm calling on you to list these games that follow the stereotypical fantasy genre. And these would be games that I feel offend on this nature.
Yeah. All right. So there's the Witcher series, which is a trilogy of games, I believe, currently.
But we don't have that much time, so I'm sorry, I don't mean to rush you.
Yeah, all right. There's the Witcher series, of course, Elder Scrolls. There's the Dungeons and Dragons series of games like Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale that are based on that universe. There's the Dragon Quest series, which is a JRPG but still falls into the tropes. And Final Fantasy actually tends to stray away from the tropes, but it does fall into them occasionally with certain games. There's the Dragon Age series, Fable series, Game of Thrones, which often has these fantasy
Can I say something about that?
What?
Because of my feelings about fantasy and just how sick I am of typical fantasy, I really kind of hate everyone assuming I've watched that show.
Yeah, I don't even want to
like it. It's so ubiquitous that like everyone just assumes everyone watches it, and if you don't, like they're like, "What?" You know what I mean?
Yeah, I completely understand that, and I personally do not really feel.
Sorry. Finish your sentence.
I agree with you, and that's why I don't watch that or have read any of the books.
It feels like people are going like, see, look, nerdy stuff is mainstream now. But I'm just like, that was nerdy stuff from 20 years ago. It was offensive. I still think it is offensive. So I feel like we can do better than that.
Yeah.
Although, again, I haven't actually watched the show, so I can't say whether that show in particular is offensive.
Yeah,
I just don't like the fantasy genre.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and of course, World of Warcraft, like the biggest MMORPG. And the Legend of Zelda series, which is 18 main series games. Yeah.
Okay, can I use some time to talk about something else I wanted to talk about? I think you might be able to guess.
Mario?
Yes.
But not just any Mario, specifically Paper Mario, right?
That would be No, I guess you're right. Yeah. I can't justify not saying that.
Yeah.
Because Paper Mario actually has a story.
Yes.
But the reason I say Mario, people might kind of shudder at that. They might be like, wait, that's not fantasy. And I would argue, no, it is fantasy. It's just not the stereotypical European medieval colonial fantasy.
I mean, it even has the trope of saving the princess.
It is a good point.
Yeah.
But I would argue that is only one similarity you can draw, and that it is very different in many regards, and that's just simply one thing it took from the stereotypical fantasy.
I understand that. I was just mentioning that as a thing that is usually in fantasy.
Right. And there's a lot of it taken from, Japanese culture and yokai, like Koopas, they're Kappas.
Yes.
So there's that, but a lot of it is really just kind of original. The mushrooms, the stars, the eyes on everything, the short, squat Italian plumber.
Yeah.
Basically, I really loved it because I felt Nintendo created their own fantasy.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that.
They made something original, and that is what I love. I love it when someone makes their own thing and they're able to pitch that to me, Mm-hmm. That's why I don't like stereotypical. I mean, I love sci-fi. I'll choose sci-fi over fantasy, but Mario to me was a different kind of fantasy. Mm-hmm. I should also mention, though, like the Eastern culture, Japanese stuff. Mm-hmm. That's actually a very kind of convenient way to circumvent the stereotypical fantasy.
Oh, yes, because like, I know I mentioned Dragon Quest, which is a JRPG, but typically JRPGs don't all or always fall into the Western fantasy stereotypes.
Well, see, the reason is that Japan has its own thriving game market. And Nintendo, being a Japanese company, was the one to revitalize the entire game industry. So Japan has a very big presence when it comes to the video game stage.
Yes.
So this is unique to video games. You know, the fantasy trope affects more than just games. But video games, or at least the ones that we see coming out of Japan, I'm sure there's movies and stuff where this is present in Japan. But by having a different culture to draw upon, one that to us in the Western audience is foreign to us, can come across as like an original fantasy when really it's actually just drawing from a culture that we don't know much about.
Yeah, I feel like that really helped make it so original, though.
Yeah. I mean, for the longest time, I never even knew about the Japanese roots within the Mario franchise.
Actually, another exception, I believe we've talked about this, is you thought Magic the Gathering was typical fantasy.
Oh, I avoided it for so long.
Yeah, but once you got into it, you felt like it had enough variety
Well, see, because
it was worth it.
the stereotypical fantasy, the template with all the orcs and elves and whatnot, that is definitely present within Magic. But it's not the only thing. Magic,
No.
oh, by the way, we should say this. Magic the Gathering is a card game.
Yes, but they also have video games based on the card game. Yeah.
I don't really care for most of their games, except for Battlegrounds.
Yeah, Battlegrounds.
But I avoided the card game because I didn't want the fantasy. But it turns out they employ many different types of fantasy.
Oh, yes.
I really like the Eldrazi, which is reminiscent on Lovecraftian eldritch creatures. And then there's also the automata ones.
Yes.
They're basically fantastical robots.
There's zombies.
Yeah, like because the thing with Magic is they have 5 main types, really. And each one appeals to a different type of fantasy. So if you pick green, if you pick the grass one, the plant one, whatever you call it, then you're going to get more stereotypical fantasy. You're going to get elves and whatnot.
And lots of creatures and animals and stuff that sort of fit into that.
Exactly. But if you pick some of the other ones, you'll get other variations. And there is definitely crossover. But with red, you get more brutish kind of warrior things. It's actually, I feel like, the most close to the real world when it comes to...
If you get white, you get more angelic or...
Well, with red, you also get fire, like dragons.
Oh, yes.
But yeah, you pick white, you get Christian themes to it.
Yeah.
Where if you get black, you get more satanic or heretical things, like devilish disease.
Black magic.
Right, vampires. And then you got blue. You get kind of more, I feel, what's the word? Rejuvenating?
Yes.
Anyway, it's going to be it. We've talked on for so long. Tell us what you guys think. We have an email at gametheorems@gmail.com, and we have all our social media links in the description. Let us know if you got anything wrong or if you want to give your opinion. I know this might have been blasphemous to some of you. I hope you will give us some slack.
Yeah.
Not too much, though. We own up to what we think.
Yeah. All right.
Bye.
Bye.